My name is Ethan Barnes, and I'm 27 years old. I've always been the type to plan things down to the last detail, whether it's a weekend road trip or a camping excursion. That's why, when my friends and I decided to spend a weekend exploring White Rock Mountain in Arkansas, I took the lead. I mapped out our route, packed enough supplies for any emergency, and reassured everyone that we'd have an unforgettable adventure. I wasn't wrong about that last part, but not in the way I'd hoped. It was late September, the perfect time to hit the trails without the summer crowds or oppressive heat. My friends, Claire, Mia, and Ryan, joined me in my RV, which doubled as our shelter for the weekend. Claire, 26, was the sharp-tongued skeptic of the group, always ready to poke holes in anyone else's logic. She made it clear from the start that she didn't believe in ghost stories. Ryan, 28, was the jokester, the kind of guy who'd fake a bear sighting just to get a rise out of you. And then there was Mia, 25, quiet and thoughtful, with this uncanny knack for sensing things before they happened. Our destination was White Rock Mountain, known for its rugged trails and sweeping views. It was also known, according to the locals, for something darker, a spectral presence they called the Devil's Whistle. I'd overheard a park ranger mention it while picking up our permits. Supposedly, it lured travelers off the path with an eerie, unearthly sound. I'd laughed it off, of course. Folklore like that was just part of the charm of camping in a place like this, or so I thought. The drive up the mountain was smooth, and by late afternoon we'd found a secluded spot to park the RV. The area was perfect, far enough from the main trails to avoid other campers, but close enough to the ridge for stunning sunset views. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we built a small fire and settled in for the night. Ryan, naturally, couldn't resist stirring the pot. "So, anyone hear about this Devil's Whistle thing?" he asked, grinning as he poked the fire with a stick. Mia's face tightened, but she didn't say anything. Claire rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. It's just a story to keep tourists from wandering off. Probably made up by the same people who think Bigfoot is real." "I don't know," Ryan said, his grin widening. "I heard it can mimic voices. Maybe if we're lucky, it'll sound like Claire, so we don't have to listen to her for real." "Ha ha," Claire deadpanned. I chuckled, shaking my head. "All right, enough. Let's get some sleep. Big hike tomorrow." That night, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but it wasn't quite right. It had a tune, faint and uneven, like someone trying to hum a melody they didn't fully remember. I sat up, listening. "Ethan?" Mia's voice was a whisper from across the RV. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, though she probably couldn't see me in the dark. "It's just the wind," I said, more to convince myself than her, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, we hit the trail. The crisp air and golden sunlight made it easy to forget the strange sound from the night before, at least for a while. But as the day wore on, little things started to go wrong. My compass stopped working, the needle spinning aimlessly no matter how I adjusted it. Mia's lantern, which she'd just replaced the batteries in, flickered and died. Even the map seemed off, with landmarks not matching up to where we thought we were. "We're not lost, are we?" Claire asked, her tone sharp. "Of course not," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. By mid-afternoon, tensions were running high. Ryan's jokes were grating on Claire's nerves, and Mia was unusually quiet, her eyes darting to the tree line as though she were expecting something, or someone, to emerge. It was around then that we heard it, the whistle. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as we walked, it grew louder. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to drift through the air surrounding us. "Okay, who's messing with me?" Ryan said, spinning around to face the group. "Not everything's a prank, Ryan," Claire snapped. Mia stopped walking, her face pale. "It's not the wind," she said softly. I wanted to reassure her, but I couldn't explain the sound. It wasn't natural. That evening, we decided to make camp earlier than planned. The whistle hadn't stopped, though it faded whenever we tried to pinpoint its source. By the time we built a fire, everyone was on edge. Ryan, for once, wasn't joking. He kept glancing over his shoulder, muttering about how weird the forest felt. Claire buried herself in a book, pretending not to notice, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the flashlight. Mia sat close to the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. "It feels wrong here," she said. I opened my mouth to respond, but the whistle cut through the air louder than ever. This time, it wasn't a tune. It was a single, piercing note, long and mournful like a signal or a warning. And then it spoke. "Ethan." It was my name, clear as day, in a voice that sounded almost like Mia's, but not quite. Panic spread through the group like wildfire. Claire shouted at Ryan to stop messing around, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her disbelief. Mia clung to my arm, whispering, "It's here. It's close." Then we saw it. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was wrong, almost human but stretched, as though someone had tried to mold it from clay and failed. Its mouth opened, and the whistle poured out, warping into a twisted mockery of Ryan's laugh. Ryan froze, his usual bravado gone. "What? What the hell is that?" No one answered. The creature moved closer, its joints creaking like old wood. I grabbed Mia's hand and shouted for everyone to run. We ran blindly through the forest, the whistle following us. It grew louder, sharper, each note cutting through the night like a blade. At one point, I tripped and looked back to see the creature standing over me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Ethan," it whispered in my own voice. Mia pulled me to my feet and we kept running. Claire shouted something about a stream, and I remembered the ranger's words. Moving water. We reached the stream just as the creature lunged for Ryan. He threw his backpack at it, the contents spilling as it tore through the fabric. The distraction was enough. We crossed the water and didn't stop until we reached the RV. We drove down the mountain in silence, the whistle fading behind us. None of us spoke about what we'd seen, but the fear in their eyes told me we all remembered it the same way. Weeks later, I woke in the middle of the night to a familiar sound. The whistle. It was faint, coming from outside my apartment window. It's still with me. My name is Sarah Collins, and I'm 34 years old. A few months ago, I quit my high-stress corporate job in Little Rock and decided I needed to escape completely. No emails, no deadlines, no people. Just me, my RV, and the open road. This is how I ended up at the Caddo River Recreation Area in Arkansas, seeking peace and clarity. What I found instead was something I still can't explain. The first day felt perfect. After a few hours of driving through winding mountain roads, I reached the campsite. A secluded spot nestled between the dense forest and the soft, steady rush of the Caddo River. My RV fit snugly into the clearing, with enough space to set up a chair and enjoy the view of the water. I spent the afternoon hiking along the trails, letting the quiet of the woods wash over me. It was exactly what I needed. No buzzing phones, no nagging bosses, just the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. When I returned to camp, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove and settled into my chair to watch the stars emerge. That's when I heard it. a faint giggle, high-pitched and fleeting, like the laugh of a small child. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. It didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trails, and the nearest campsite was a good half-mile away. It's just the wind, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next evening it happened again. I'd spent the day exploring another trail and returned to camp feeling sore but satisfied. As the sky darkened, I lit a small fire and stretched out in my chair, trying to ignore the creeping unease that had followed me since the giggle the night before. Then, at the edge of the tree line, I saw them. 3 children stood in the shadows, barely illuminated by the flickering firelight. They were silent, their faces pale and expressionless. "Hey," I called, standing up. "Are you lost?" They didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped toward them, but as the beam swept over the spot where they stood, they vanished. A chill ran down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, shining the flashlight into the trees, but there was no sign of them. No rustling leaves, no snapped twigs, just silence. The following day, I decided to hike a different trail, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. Halfway through, I met a woman collecting herbs near a bend in the path. She was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes and weathered hands. She glanced up as I approached and gave me a wary smile. "Not often I see people out here alone," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Just needed some time to myself," I replied. "It's beautiful here." She nodded but didn't seem convinced. "You're camping near the river, aren't you?" "Yes. Why?" Her expression darkened. "You should leave before nightfall." The sudden seriousness in her tone made my stomach tighten. "Why?" I asked again, forcing a laugh. "Is this about bears or something?" "No," she said. "The children, they watch, and if you're not careful, they'll invite you to play." I felt a chill at her words, but I forced myself to stay skeptical. "Children? You mean other campers?" She shook her head. "They're not alive. They haven't been for a long time." I didn't know what to say to that. I muttered a polite goodbye and hurried back to my RV, determined to put the strange encounter out of my mind. That night, I woke to a sound. Knocking. It was soft at first, almost tentative, but it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding. Then I heard the giggle again, followed by a small voice. "Come play with us." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The voice sounded like a child, but there was something wrong with it, something too high-pitched, too eager. The knocking stopped. Summoning all my courage, I peeked out the window. One of the children was standing right outside the RV door staring up at me. Its face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight. It smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, my chest heaving. When I looked again, the child was gone. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up the RV, started the engine, and turned toward the main road. But after driving for what felt like 20 minutes, I found myself back at the same campsite. The river rushed quietly beside me, unchanged, as though I had never left. I tried again, this time turning the opposite way, but the same thing happened. No matter which direction I went, I ended up back in the clearing. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone only to find that it had no signal, not even enough to send a text. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I had no choice but to spend another night. The children came again. This time, there were 3 of them, standing at the edge of the firelight. They didn't move, didn't speak, they just watched. "Leave me alone," I shouted, grabbing a branch from the fire and brandishing it like a weapon. The children didn't flinch. Then, one of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Play with us," it said. its voice hollow and echoing. The branch in my hand flickered and dimmed. The fire shrank, as though the very air around me had turned cold. Suddenly, a voice called out from the woods, "Sarah, over here!" It was the woman I'd met on the trail. She appeared at the edge of the clearing, holding a bundle of herbs and a smoldering stick. The children hissed and retreated into the shadows as she approached. "They won't stop until they have you," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to cross the river." "But my RV..." "Forget the RV. If you stay here, you won't survive the night." I followed her toward the river, clutching a lantern that flickered ominously. Behind us, the children reappeared, their faces twisted with rage. They didn't speak this time, but their hollow eyes seemed to burn into me. The woman chanted under her breath, waving the smoldering stick in their direction. The children slowed, but they didn't stop. When we reached the water's edge, the woman turned to me. "Go. Don't look back." "What about you?" She smiled faintly. "This is my burden." Before I could argue, she pushed me toward the river. I waded in, the icy water soaking through my jeans. Behind me, the children screamed, a sound so inhuman it made my blood run cold. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the other side, the forest was silent. The woman was gone. I stumbled onto the road and flagged down a passing car, babbling incoherently about children and spirits. The driver, a kind older man, took me to the nearest town, where I called for help. I never went back for the RV. Weeks later, I read an article about the Caddo River campsite. It had been closed due to unexplained disturbances. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the giggling, but I know better than to answer. My name is Lucas Harper, but most people just call me Luke. I'm 31 years old and make my living as a freelance travel photographer. For me, nothing beats the thrill of finding untouched wilderness, capturing its beauty, and sharing it with the world. That's why I found myself parked at a remote campsite near Bear Ridge, deep in the Arkansas wilderness, with my RV as my only companion. This trip was supposed to be like any other, a quiet getaway to snap some breathtaking shots of autumn foliage for a magazine spread. But what happened out there changed the way I look at the world and the shadows within it. Bear Ridge was everything I hoped it would be. The forest glowed with gold and crimson leaves, and the Buffalo River wound lazily through the valley below. After parking the RV in a secluded clearing, I spent the afternoon scouting locations for sunrise shots, marking trails and angles that would make for stunning compositions. I stopped by a small general store on my way back to camp, mostly to grab a snack, and overheard two locals chatting by the counter. "Bear Ridge? You're heading there alone?" one of them asked, glancing at my camera bag. "Yeah, just for a few days," I replied. The older man behind the counter shook his head. "Careful out there. People say it's cursed." I chuckled, trying to brush it off. "Cursed? How so?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "The Witch of Bear Ridge. She was executed back in the 1800s for putting curses on settlers' crops and livestock. They say her spirit still haunts the woods, punishing those who don't respect her land." His warning sounded like a tourist trap, designed to spook out-of-towners. I nodded politely, paid for my snacks, and left. The forest was eerily silent that evening, with no distant hum of cicadas or rustle of animals in the underbrush. As I cooked dinner over my camp stove, I felt the kind of quiet you notice, like the woods were holding their breath. Then, faintly, I heard it. A woman's voice, soft and melodic, singing a tune I couldn't quite place. It seemed to float through the trees, carried by a breeze that chilled the air. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, but no one answered. After a moment, the voice stopped, leaving the silence even heavier than before. The next morning, I hiked to a vantage point I'd scouted the day before. The climb was tough, but the view was worth it. Endless waves of color stretching toward the horizon. I was setting up my tripod when I heard footsteps on the trail behind me. Turning, I saw a man in a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Morning," he greeted, his voice gravelly. "You camping down by the ridge?" "Yeah, just for a few days," I replied, focusing on adjusting my lens. The man frowned. "You shouldn't be here. That ridge isn't safe." I sighed, exasperated. "Let me guess. The witch?" He nodded, his expression grim. "It's not just a story. She watches, waits for people to disrespect the land. If you hear her voice, don't answer. If you see her, don't run. She feeds on fear." I was about to argue when I noticed the haunted look in his eyes. Whatever he believed it completely. "Thanks for the advice," I said, trying to sound polite. He didn't respond, just gave me a long, knowing look before turning back down the trail. That evening, my equipment started acting up. The GPS on my phone showed me in a completely different part of the forest, and my camera refused to focus no matter how many settings I adjusted. Frustrated, I decided to call it a night. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I woke to a scratching sound outside the RV. It started faint, like twigs brushing against the door, but it grew louder and more deliberate. "Probably a raccoon," I muttered, trying to reassure myself. Then the singing began again, closer this time. I peeked out the window and saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing, her figure barely illuminated by the moonlight. She was gaunt, her long hair hanging in matted strands, and her eyes glowed faintly like dying embers. I blinked, and she was gone. The next morning I packed up, ready to leave, but no matter which direction I drove, the road looped back to the same clearing. By the third attempt, panic began to creep in. I decided to hike back to the general store to ask for help, but the forest seemed to shift around me, leading me in circles. Trees I'd marked earlier were gone, replaced by unfamiliar ones. The birds were the worst. Blackbirds swarmed above me, their cries echoing through the trees. They followed me everywhere, their dark forms flitting between branches, watching. By the time I stumbled back to camp, my nerves were shot. I sat inside the RV, clutching my camera like it could protect me, when I heard a knock on the door. It was her voice again. "Luke," she called, soft and sweet, "let me in." My breath caught. I hadn't told anyone my name. Desperate, I grabbed the only weapon I had, a kitchen knife, and headed into the woods. If I was stuck here, I wasn't going down without a fight. The air grew colder as I walked, and the trees closed in around me. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, and the singing returned, louder and more dissonant. Finally, I reached a massive, gnarled tree in a clearing. Its roots twisted like skeletal fingers, and the air around it felt heavy, oppressive. I knew instinctively that this was her anchor. The witch appeared, stepping out from behind the tree. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and her voice filled my head, not just with words, but with feelings, fear, guilt, despair. "You don't belong here," she hissed. My hands trembled, but I lit the torch I'd made and thrust it toward the tree. The flames licked at the bark, and the witch shrieked, her form flickering like a dying flame. The fire spread quickly, consuming the ancient tree. The witch lunged at me one last time, but as the fire reached its peak, she vanished in a cloud of ash. When I stumbled back to the RV, the forest felt different, lighter, quieter, like it had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. I drove down the road without incident. reaching the main highway as the sun rose. I still don't know what she was or why she chose me, but weeks later, as I edited the photos from that trip, I found something chilling. In one of the shots, taken long before the nightmares began, she was there. Faint but unmistakable, standing in the background watching. My name is Ben Carter. I'm 42 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened 2 years ago in Richland Creek Wilderness, Arkansas. I've always thought of myself as a practical guy, logical, prepared, and level-headed. I've taken my family camping dozens of times, but nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare we endured that weekend. It was late spring, the kind of weather perfect for a camping trip. My wife, Carly, 38, wanted to get out of the house and take some photos of waterfalls, and I thought it'd be a good opportunity to teach our kids some survival skills. Megan, our 12-year-old daughter, wasn't thrilled about leaving her phone behind for the weekend. Andy, 8, was more enthusiastic, though that kid's curiosity sometimes got the better of him. We loaded up our old RV, a relic from the 90s that had seen better days, and headed to Richland Creek. The place was as beautiful as I remembered. Dense green trees, crystal clear creeks, and rocky cliffs. The nearest other campers were miles away, which suited me just fine. I liked the isolation. Carly set up her camera almost immediately, and Andy darted off to the creek while I started a fire. Megan sat on a folding chair with her arms crossed, glaring at the woods like they'd personally insulted her. I tried to get her involved, handing her some paracord to practice knot tying. She rolled her eyes but obliged. "Dad!" Andy called from the creek. "Look what I found." He came running back with his hands full of small, smooth rocks, each one oddly shaped. One in particular caught my attention. A triangular rock with a faint reddish hue. I frowned. The rock didn't look natural, more like it had been carved or polished. "Where'd you get that?" I asked. "By the water," Andy said, beaming. "Can I keep it?" "Just don't lose it," I said, brushing off a faint sense of unease. That night, as the campfire crackled and Carly fiddled with her camera, Megan claimed she heard something. "It's like crying," she said, looking out into the darkness. "It's just a bobcat," I assured her. "They make weird noises." Carly nodded in agreement, but Megan didn't seem convinced. After some coaxing, we all settled into the RV for the night. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A soft dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I sat up, peering out the window, but saw nothing. Telling myself it was probably an animal, I went back to bed. The next day, Carly showed us some of the photos she'd taken. Most of them were breathtaking shots of the creek and the surrounding forest. But one photo made my stomach twist, a shot of the creek, with a shadowy figure in the background. It was tall and skeletal, almost human in shape but with elongated limbs. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a blur from the water. Carly laughed nervously. "Guess I caught Bigfoot." Megan wasn't amused. "It's not funny, Mom. I've seen claw marks on the trees near camp." "Probably just a bear," I said, trying to calm her down. "No bear did this," she muttered. Later that afternoon, while Carly photographed a nearby waterfall, Megan and I found Andy stacking rocks by the creek. The triangular stone was perched on top. "Andy, what are you doing?" I asked. "Just playing," he said. But there was something in his voice, something off. I made him stop and take the rocks back to the RV. That night, the noises started again. This time, they weren't just dragging sounds. There was scratching, loud enough to wake everyone. Megan screamed when she saw the deep gouges along the RV's side visible in the moonlight. "What the hell?" Carly whispered, her voice trembling. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The night was eerily still, the kind of silence that feels wrong. I scanned the area but found nothing. When I climbed back into the RV, Megan was shaking, and Carly was trying to comfort Andy, who had started growling like an animal. I told myself he was just scared, but his eyes, they didn't look like his anymore. By morning, I was ready to pack up and leave, but the RV wouldn't start. I checked the engine, the battery, everything I could think of, but it was dead. Carly tried to keep the kids calm while I worked, but Andy's behavior was getting worse. He was ravenous, tearing through our food like he hadn't eaten in days. "I don't feel so good," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Carly touched his forehead. "He's burning up." That's when Megan spoke up. "Dad, I think it's the rock. The triangle one." "What are you talking about?" I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "It's cursed or something. You saw the pictures, the claw marks. This thing doesn't want us here." I wanted to tell her she was being ridiculous, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. That night was the worst. We huddled in the RV, the kids asleep on the bed while Carly and I whispered about what to do. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from outside. It wasn't Andy this time. It was deeper, more guttural. I peeked through the window and froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the creature from Carly's photo. It was impossibly tall, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth hung open in a grotesque grin. "Ben!" Carly whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. The creature started moving, circling the RV. Its clawed hands scraped against the metal walls, sending shivers down my spine. Inside, Andy began to stir, growling and clawing at his blankets. Megan screamed, "We have to put the rock back!" Carly grabbed the triangular stone and shoved it into my hands. "She's right. Go!" I didn't want to leave the RV, but I knew we had no choice. Gripping the rock tightly, I stepped outside. The creature was still circling, its glowing eyes fixed on me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move toward the creek. The closer I got to the water, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the forest itself were alive and watching me. I reached the pile of stones Andy had made and placed the triangular rock back on top. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a bone-chilling scream tore through the night. The creature lunged at me, its claws missing my face by inches. Before I could react, Carly appeared, flashing her camera in its face. The burst of light startled it, and it retreated into the woods, hissing and snarling. We didn't waste any time. Carly grabbed the kids and we ran, left the RV, left everything. By the time we reached the main road at dawn, we were exhausted but alive. We never went back for the RV. The insurance company called it a total loss and I didn't argue. Andy recovered, but he doesn't remember much of what happened. Megan still talks about the creature sometimes, and Carly refuses to look at the photos she took that weekend. As for me, I still can't explain what we saw or what happened. But I know one thing for sure. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some things should stay buried. My name is Samantha O'Connell. I'm 33 years old, and this happened last fall when I was camping alone in the Ozark National Forest. I've been living in my RV for almost a year now, traveling to beautiful places and documenting my adventures for my travel blog. It's a life I chose after walking away from a suffocating corporate job. I wanted peace, freedom, and solitude. But on this particular trip to White Rock Mountain, I found something else entirely. Something I still can't explain. It started like any other trip. I parked my RV at a quiet campsite surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and smelled of earth and pine needles, a far cry from the city smog I used to breathe every day. The campground was practically empty, save for an elderly couple in a trailer a few sites down. They waved but didn't come over to chat. I liked that. My first day was uneventful. I hiked to the overlook, took some pictures for my blog, and spent the evening reading by the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. I felt perfectly at ease. The next morning, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. When I stepped out of the RV, I noticed smudges on the windows, small handprints too small to be an adult's. I brushed them off, figuring it was some kind of prank by the elderly couple's grandkids or maybe an animal I didn't know about. Later, I stopped at the general store at the base of the mountain to grab a few supplies. The cashier, a wiry older man with a sunburned face, gave me a strange look as I handed over my money. "You camping up there alone?" he asked. "Yeah, why?" I replied. He hesitated. "Just don't go wandering after dark. And if you hear anything strange, stay inside. Don't go looking for it." I laughed nervously. "Thanks for the tip." He didn't laugh back. That afternoon, I decided to explore a lesser-known trail that wasn't on the park map. I'd seen it marked by a faint, weathered signpost while hiking the day before. The path was overgrown and wound steeply upward, twisting through the dense pines. After about an hour, I stumbled across what looked like ruins. Stone foundations and charred timbers half buried under moss and dirt. A chill ran down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wandered closer. The air felt colder here, unnaturally so, and the forest was eerily silent. As I examined the ruins, I spotted something in the dirt. A small blackened doll, its face cracked and burned. The sight of it made me uneasy, but I slipped it into my backpack, thinking it might make an interesting photo for my blog. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard laughter. Faint, high-pitched, and coming from the woods. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just the wind or some animal. I pulled the covers over my head and forced myself to sleep. By the second morning, I was starting to feel more than uneasy. My RV battery had drained overnight, leaving me without power. My satellite phone wouldn't connect, though it had worked perfectly the day before. I tried to brush it off as bad luck, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. After breakfast, I decided to take the doll back to the ruins. The thought of keeping it in my RV gave me the creeps. As I approached the orphanage site, the air felt colder again, and I heard faint whispers. So faint I couldn't make out the words. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the wind through the trees, or the echoes of my own footsteps. Still, I hurriedly placed the doll where I'd found it and left without looking back. That evening, the laughter returned. This time, it was louder, closer. It seemed to come from just outside the RV. My hands trembled as I locked all the doors and windows. Suddenly, there was a knock. 3 sharp taps on the door. My breath caught in my throat. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Just silence. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement through the window. A child, no more than 7 or 8, standing just beyond the firelight. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I shone it outside, he was gone. By the 3rd day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept, and my nerves were shot. The elderly couple's RV was gone, leaving me completely alone. I decided to pack up and leave, but the engine wouldn't start. I cursed under my breath and climbed out to check the battery. That's when I noticed the small footprints in the dirt around my campsite, barefoot and child-sized. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. As I sat in the driver's seat, trying the ignition again, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A group of children standing in a semicircle around the RV. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their bodies partially translucent. My blood turned to ice. I turned to look, but they were gone. "Get a grip, Sam," I muttered to myself. "You're just tired, this isn't real." But it felt real, too real. That night, they came inside. I woke to the sound of laughter echoing through the RV. It was coming from everywhere, above me, beneath me, right next to me. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the small space, my heart pounding. The children stood at the foot of my bed, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Their mouths moved, but their voices seemed to come from the walls. "Stay with us," one whispered. "Play with us." "No!" I shouted, scrambling back against the wall. The flashlight slipped from my hand, plunging the RV into darkness. I could feel them moving closer, their icy breath against my skin. Desperate, I remembered the doll. It had to be connected to them somehow. I grabbed my backpack and tore through it until I found the charred toy. With shaking hands, I stumbled outside and ran toward the ruins. The children followed, their laughter turning to shrieks. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending as if alive. When I reached the orphanage site, I dropped the doll on the ground and pulled out my lighter. The moment the flame touched the fabric, the screams grew deafening. The doll burned quickly, and as it turned to ash, the children's forms began to fade. Their eyes lost their glow, and their expressions softened. For a brief moment, I thought I saw relief on their faces before they disappeared entirely. The forest fell silent. The RV started the next morning, as if nothing had happened. I didn't waste any time leaving. As I drove down the mountain, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The ruins were barely visible through the trees, but I thought I saw a faint, flickering light. A candle, perhaps, or a final goodbye. I never wrote about the children or the doll. My blog post about White Rock Mountain focused on the scenic overlooks and hiking trails. But sometimes, late at night when I'm parked in a new campsite, I hear faint laughter in the distance, and I wonder if they're still looking for someone to play with. My name is Robert Harris, but most people call me Rob. I'm 47 years old, and what I'm about to share happened last October at Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or curses. I've spent my life fighting fires, dealing with real dangers, not fairy tales. But this trip wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced, and even now, I'm not sure how to explain what happened. It started as a way to clear my head. My wife, Marcy, had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. I needed to get away from the house, from the constant reminders of her absence. Devil's Den seemed like the perfect escape. Quiet trails, stunning views, and time to be alone with my thoughts. I parked my RV in a secluded campsite at the edge of the park, nestled in a hollow surrounded by towering cliffs. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the sound of wind rustling through the leaves. Setting up camp was uneventful, but by late afternoon I noticed something strange. The rocks near the edge of the hollow had odd, charred patterns on them, like they'd been burned in a fire that never spread. As I examined them, I felt a chill run through me, but I brushed it off as the cooler evening air. On the trail back to my RV, I ran into an old man carrying a bundle of firewood. He looked like a local, scruffy, with a weathered face and a faraway look in his eyes. "Staying down in the hollow?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I replied. "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Just don't linger too long." Shadows here don't always stay where they belong. I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking or serious. He didn't smile, just stared at me with a look that sent a shiver down my spine before turning and walking away. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but they seemed to come from every direction at once. I told myself it was just the sound of leaves rustling, but it unsettled me enough to retreat into the RV early. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the fire outside completely extinguished. That wasn't unusual. Fires go out. But when I stepped out to check, I found symbols drawn in ash around the RV. They were crude, circular patterns with jagged lines, like something out of an old ritual. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, maybe from some bored teens camping nearby. I grabbed a flashlight and scanned the woods, but saw nothing. The silence was oppressive, so thick it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I kicked the ash aside and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I set out on a long hike, hoping to clear my mind. The trail was steep, and after about an hour I found an old, hollowed-out tree at the base of a cliff. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and weathered with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I sat down to read. The entries were written in shaky, frantic handwriting. They described a man staying in the hollow decades ago, hearing whispers and seeing shadows. One entry caught my attention. The shadow spoke to me tonight. It offered me peace, relief from all my pain, if I would only stay here. It knows my guilt, it knows my grief. I fear I am too weak to refuse. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It felt too close to home. I shoved the journal into my pack and hurried back to camp. That evening, I tried to focus on making dinner, but the whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to echo in my ears, forming words I couldn't quite understand. As the firelight flickered, I felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the hollow, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, its body unnaturally stretched, with a glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, I heard Marcy's voice, soft, loving, and familiar. "Rob," she said, "it's me." My heart clenched. I knew it couldn't be her, but the sound of her voice broke something inside me. Tears blurred my vision as the figure stepped closer, its features becoming more defined. Its face was human but twisted, its skin dark and cracked like burnt wood. "Stay," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "Stay, and I will give her back to you." I backed away, my mind racing. "You're not real. This isn't real." It smiled, a grotesque, inhuman grin. "You cannot outrun your guilt." I fled into the RV and locked the door, my hands trembling. The whispers continued outside, louder and more insistent, until they became a deafening roar. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was determined to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died no matter how many times I tried. I checked the battery, the fuel. Everything seemed fine, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, I pulled out the journal and flipped through it, searching for answers. One of the final entries caught my eye. The only way to break its hold is to destroy the mark it left, the symbol on the rocks. It ties the hollow to the shadow. Burn it, and it will weaken. I thought of the charred marks I'd seen on the rocks my first day here. If there was even a chance it could end this nightmare, I had to try. That night, the entity returned. This time, it didn't stay at the edge of the hollow. It came closer, its long, skeletal limbs moving unnaturally as it circled the RV. The whispers turned to screams, and the RV shook violently as if something was clawing at the walls. "Stay with me," it growled. "Stay, and she will be yours again." "No!" I shouted, grabbing my lighter and heading outside. The creature loomed over me, its red eyes glowing like embers. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move toward the rocks. The symbols were there, glowing faintly in the dark. As I flicked the lighter and held the flame to the dry grass around the rocks, the entity roared, its voice shaking the ground. Shadows swirled around me, clawing at my arms and legs, but I didn't stop. The fire caught, engulfing the rocks in bright, searing flames. The entity let out a final, ear-splitting scream before vanishing into the darkness. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight I'd felt since arriving lifted. When the sun rose, the hollow looked ordinary again, as if nothing had happened. The RV started without issue, and I wasted no time leaving. I still don't know what I encountered in Devil's Den, but I do know one thing. It knew me. It knew my pain, my guilt, and it tried to use them against me. I've learned to live with my regrets, but I'll never forget the shadow in the hollow and the pact I almost made. My name is Rachel Morgan, and I was 28 when this happened. To this day, I can't set foot in the woods without hearing the voices. I thought I'd been prepared for anything on that camping trip. Bad weather, maybe a bear sighting, or some stupid argument among my friends. But I wasn't ready for what found us in the Ouachita National Forest. It was early October, just the right season for a weekend in the woods. The air was crisp, the leaves painted in fiery hues, and the forest stretched out endlessly under a bright blue sky. I'd planned the trip to bring our fractured group back together. It had been years since we'd all gotten along, and I thought nature might be the cure. I was wrong. My best friend Sienna had been the first to agree. She's 27, a bubbly, endlessly curious free spirit who's into folklore and crystals. When she suggested we camp near a site rumored to be haunted by skinwalkers, I figured it was just another one of her quirks. Then came Leo, 29, the kind of guy who's always cracking jokes that cut a little too deep. He and Sienna argued constantly. Finally, there was Jason, my boyfriend, who didn't want to come at all. At 30, Jason was a tech-savvy introvert who thought Wi-Fi was as essential to life as oxygen. We set off early Saturday morning, squeezing into my RV. The drive was smooth, but tensions were already simmering. Jason fiddled with his phone, muttering about the lack of service, while Sienna leaned over the map, giddy about her research on skinwalkers. "They're shapeshifters," she said, flipping through her notebook. "They mimic voices and can take on human form. Super creepy, right?" Leo snorted. "Creepy? More like total BS?" "Don't mock it," Sienna shot back. "These stories go back centuries. There's truth in them." I tried to lighten the mood. "Let's just enjoy the weekend, okay? No fights, no debates. Just us and nature." But the tension was palpable, and it only grew worse when Jason's navigation app glitched, leading us down an unmarked dirt road deep into the forest. By the time we found a clearing, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the trees. "This isn't on the map," Jason said, frowning. "We should go back." "No way," Sienna said. "This is perfect. Look how secluded it is." Leo gestured toward the RV. "Secluded and creepy. Great job, Rach." I forced a smile, hiding my irritation. "Let's set up camp." We pitched our tents by flashlight. Sienna's had a broken zipper, so she ended up in the RV. Leo's flashlight flickered ominously, and Jason grumbled about not having a signal. I tried to reassure myself it was just bad luck, but a chill crawled up my spine. The forest was too quiet. the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I woke to the sound of laughter. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. It sounded like Sienna and Jason, their voices muffled but distinct. I unzipped my tent and stepped out. The RV was dark, and Jason's tent was zipped shut. My breath fogged in the cold air as I turned in circles, searching for the source of the sound. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. I climbed back into my tent, heart pounding, and lay awake until dawn. The next morning, I told the group what I'd heard. "You were dreaming," Leo said, chewing on a granola bar. "I wasn't," I insisted. "It was too real." Sienna's eyes lit up. Maybe it was the skinwalker. They're known for mimicking voices. Jason rolled his eyes. "It's probably an echo or something. Let's just stick to the plan and hike today." We set off on foot, heading toward a stream Sienna had marked on the map. The hike was beautiful, but unease clung to me like a shadow. Every now and then I caught movement in the corner of my eye, branches swaying when there was no wind, shapes darting between the trees. Leo must have felt it too, though he'd never admit it. He cracked jokes to fill the silence, but his laugh was brittle. "Hey, Sienna," he called out, pointing to a clearing ahead. "Think your skinwalker lives there?" She ignored him, her focus on a series of strange markings etched into the bark of a tree. They looked like claw marks, deep and deliberate. "These are fresh," she murmured. Jason leaned in, frowning. "Bear, maybe?" Sienna shook her head. "Too big, and bears don't make patterns like this." I pulled her back. "Let's keep moving." By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting. As we gathered around the fire, the unease had turned into a tangible weight. Leo tried to lighten the mood by telling ghost stories, but they fell flat. Even he seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes. Then we heard it. A faint, almost human wail drifting through the trees. "What the hell was that?" Jason whispered. Leo stood, peering into the darkness. "Probably an animal." Sienna's face was pale. That wasn't an animal. The wailing grew louder, closer. It sounded like someone crying out for help. "Jason?" a voice called, high and desperate. Jason froze. "Who's there?" "Don't," Sienna hissed. "It's not human." But Jason stepped toward the sound. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "We stick together." The voice faded, leaving us in a silence so thick it felt alive. That night, I barely slept. I could hear the others shifting restlessly in their tents. Around 3 a.m., a scraping sound echoed through the campsite. I peeked out and saw a figure at the edge of the firelight. A twisted, half-human, half-deer shape with glowing eyes. It was clawing symbols into the dirt. My breath caught in my throat. I ducked back inside, trembling. When I finally dared to look again, the figure was gone, but the symbols remained. The next morning, we found bloody animal pelts draped over the RV. The tires were slashed, and claw marks gouged the side of the vehicle. Panic set in. We were stranded, and the forest seemed to close in around us. Sienna suggested a ritual she'd read about, using sage to ward off the skinwalker. Leo scoffed, but reluctantly helped gather supplies. As Sienna lit the sage and chanted, the air grew heavy, charged with electricity. A guttural growl erupted from the woods, and the creature appeared again, watching us with cold, calculating eyes. When the skinwalker attacked, it went for Leo first, slashing his arm. He screamed, stumbling back, as Jason grabbed a burning stick from the fire and swung it at the creature. It recoiled, hissing, and disappeared into the shadows. "We have to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." Carrying Leo between us, We stumbled through the forest, following Jason's faulty map. The creature pursued us, its growls echoing through the trees. At one point, it mimicked Sienna's voice, calling for help. She broke down, sobbing, but I pulled her along. Hours later, we emerged onto a road, flagging down a passing truck. The driver took us to safety, but none of us spoke of what had happened. Leo recovered, but he refused to talk about the night he'd been attacked. Jason and I broke up soon after, the strain too much to bear. Sienna stopped researching folklore, her curiosity replaced by a quiet fear. As for me, I still hear the voices. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, they call my name. My name is Alex Carter, and I was 35 when I spent 3 nights in Eden Hollow. I wish I could say it was just a bad trip, that the isolation got to me or my imagination played tricks on me. But deep down, I know what I saw and heard in those woods was real. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the whispers. This happened in early spring. I'd been divorced for about 6 months, and the house I used to share with my ex was suddenly too big, too quiet. I thought time in nature would help me clear my head and process everything. That's how I ended up in the Ozark National Forest, parked in an abandoned campsite I'd found online called Eden Hollow. Eden Hollow was supposed to be a photographer's dream. Overgrown trails, rusted playgrounds, and the remnants of a campground left to nature. My goal was to take photos of the decay, capturing the beauty in abandonment. What I didn't know was that the campsite had been abandoned for a reason. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The dirt road leading to the site was barely passable, the kind that made you second-guess whether you should turn back. But I kept going. When I finally pulled my RV into the clearing, I saw why Eden Hollow had been forgotten. The place looked like a ghost town. Rusting swings hung limp from their chains, their once bright paint flaking off in jagged strips. A picnic table sat crooked in the grass, one leg snapped clean off. The fire pit in the center of the site was filled with waterlogged debris. All around, the forest loomed, thick and dark, as if it were swallowing the campsite whole. It was perfect. I spent the first couple of hours exploring the area with my camera. The photos came out better than I'd hoped. The contrast between nature reclaiming the site and the eerie stillness of the structures was captivating. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started to feel off, like I was being watched. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. They circled the RV, crunching through the fallen leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, the beam cutting through the pitch-black night. Nothing. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart pound louder. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back to bed. But as I drifted off, I could have sworn I heard whispering, faint and far away. The next day, I ventured deeper into the woods. I had a map, but the trails were so overgrown that it was nearly useless. Still, I managed to find an old pavilion. Its roof caved in and graffiti scrawled across the concrete pillars. Most of it was harmless, names, dates, and crude drawings. But one message caught my eye. Leave while you can. I took a photo of it, my chest tightening. It was probably a joke left by some teenagers, but it didn't feel like a joke. On the way back, I spotted something half buried in the dirt near the fire pit. A stack of Polaroid photographs, their edges yellowed and brittle. I flipped through them. They showed a group of campers, smiling around the fire pit where I now stood. There were 6 of them, all around my age. In the last photo, I noticed something strange. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was blurry, but the shape was wrong, almost humanoid but twisted. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, accompanied by a faint tapping on the RV's windows. I stayed inside, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The tapping moved from one window to the next, deliberate and rhythmic. Then it stopped. I waited, barely breathing, before stepping to the window. I pulled the curtain aside, and for a split second I saw a reflection that wasn't mine. It was distorted, like a funhouse mirror version of myself, staring back with wide, unblinking eyes. The light flickered in the RV, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my lantern, and when I turned it on, I saw something etched into the condensation on the window. Stay. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I packed my things and prepared to leave. But when I went outside, I found the RV's tires slashed. Deep gouges ran through the rubber, like they'd been torn apart by claws. Bloody animal pelts were draped over the hood, and symbols had been scratched into the dirt around the RV. They weren't random. They looked like they belonged to some kind of ritual. I was stranded. The next day, I tried to hike out of the forest. I followed the map as best I could, but no matter how far I walked, I kept ending up back at the campsite. It was like the forest itself was shifting, leading me in circles. My camera, which I'd used to document everything, suddenly wouldn't turn on. Even the photos I'd taken earlier were gone, replaced by static-filled images. As the sun began to set, I heard the whispers again. They were closer now, clearer. Voices layered over one another, some angry, others pleading. Among them, I heard my ex-spouse's voice, accusing me of ruining our marriage. "Why didn't you try harder, Alex?" the voice said, sharp and venomous. "You gave up." I dropped to my knees, clutching my ears. The voices swirled around me, each word a dagger. When I looked up, the shadowy figure from the Polaroid stood at the edge of the clearing, its shape flickering like static on a broken TV. It didn't move closer, but its presence was suffocating. The final night was the worst. The RV's lights flickered on and off, and I could hear something scraping along the sides, like nails dragging across metal. I barricaded the door with everything I could find and huddled in the corner, clutching my flashlight. Around midnight, the door burst open, and I was dragged outside. The shadowy figure was joined by others now, all distorted and humanoid, their faces warped beyond recognition. They surrounded me, their whispers growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. They pulled me toward a dark pit in the forest, the air around it reeking of decay. I realized then that the pit was a grave, the final resting place of the campers from the Polaroids. Their spirits were bound to the forest, desperate for someone to join them. In a last-ditch effort, I pulled the Polaroids from my pocket and set them on fire with a lighter. The flames licked at the edges of the photos, and as they burned, the figures recoiled, their whispers turning to screams. The air grew still, and the forest fell silent. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, leaving the RV behind. A passing truck driver picked me up and took me to the nearest town. I told them my tires had blown, nothing more. The photos I took at Eden Hollow were gone, erased from my memory cards. But a week later, I found a single Polaroid slipped into my camera bag. It showed me asleep in the RV with the shadowy figure standing over me. I haven't gone camping since. My name is Clara Jennings, and I was 32 when I spent 3 nights at Whispering Creek. People who hear about my work think it's glamorous, wandering through remote landscapes, cataloging plants for conservation projects. But that trip, it changed everything. I thought I knew nature, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered at that cursed creek. This happened in the spring, during what I'd hoped would be a peaceful solo trip. Whispering Creek is tucked into a forgotten corner of the Buffalo National River. I'd read it was once a popular camping spot, but locals abandoned it decades ago, claiming the area was cursed. I'd brushed those stories aside, chalking them up to old superstitions. After all, I wasn't there for ghost stories. I was there for the rare flora rumored to grow in the area. At least, that's what I told myself. I arrived on a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that makes the world feel alive. The dirt road to Whispering Creek was barely more than a trail, and my RV's tires kicked up clouds of dust. When I finally reached the clearing, I felt a strange quiet settle over me. It wasn't the peaceful stillness I'd expected. It was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. The creek wound lazily through the clearing, its water clear and shallow. The campsite itself was overgrown, with weeds sprouting through cracked fire pits and picnic tables leaning at odd angles. On the far bank, steep cliffs rose high above the trees, their jagged edges casting long shadows. It was exactly what I was looking for, or so I thought. The first day went smoothly enough. I spent hours hiking along the creek, photographing flowers and collecting samples. The work kept my mind busy, which was good because the solitude felt heavier than usual. By evening, I'd set up camp near the creek's edge, ready for a quiet night under the stars. That's when I first heard it, the melody. It was faint, barely audible over the bubbling water, but it stopped me in my tracks. It sounded like a woman humming, a soft, lilting tune that carried on the breeze. I scanned the clearing, but no one was there. I told myself it must be the wind moving through the rocks, a trick of the acoustics. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. My heart pounded as I listened, the soft crunch of leaves unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the RV window. Nothing. Just the creek, glinting faintly in the moonlight. I stepped outside, scanning the area with my flashlight. The beam caught something near the water, a doll half buried in the mud. It was old, its fabric faded and stained, one button eye hanging by a thread. My skin prickled. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of that doll filled me with dread. I left it where it was and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I tried to focus on my work, but the atmosphere felt heavier, darker. My GPS device glitched and my waterproof camera refused to power on. Frustrated, I resorted to using my backup film camera. As I walked along the creek, the humming returned, louder this time. It sent a shiver down my spine. Then I saw it. A shadow moved beneath the water, too large to be a fish. It glided smoothly, unnaturally, before disappearing. I froze, waiting for it to surface, but the water remained still. When I developed the film later that day, the shadow was there, dark and humanoid, its edges rippling like smoke. I stared at the photo, a cold sweat prickling my skin. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong with this place. That night, the melody grew louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from the creek. It was coming from inside my mind. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the song only grew stronger, weaving itself into my thoughts like a living thing. Then came the dream. I was standing in the creek, the water cold and pulling at my ankles. A woman stood before me, her back turned. Her long dark hair floated on the surface like seaweed, and in her arms, she cradled a limp, waterlogged child. She began to hum, the same haunting melody, and I felt myself drawn toward her, unable to stop. When I woke, I was standing knee-deep in the creek, my clothes soaked and my body trembling. I stumbled back to the RV, heart racing. The doll was there, sitting on the table, though I was certain I'd left it outside. Water dripped from its ragged body, forming a puddle on the floor. I spent the third day trying to leave. I packed my samples, gathered my gear, and started the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I checked the tires and found deep gashes as if they'd been slashed. I was trapped. Desperation took over, and I decided to hike out on foot. But no matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the creek. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trails twisting and looping in impossible ways. I could feel her presence, the lady of the creek, watching, waiting. As the sun set, I returned to the RV, exhausted and terrified. The doll was gone, but the melody had returned, louder and more insistent than ever. My reflection in the RV window moved independently, its lips forming the words, "Join us." That night, the lady appeared. She rose from the water, her dress clinging to her skeletal frame. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and bloated. She carried the child in her arms, its head lolling lifelessly. The sight froze me in place, my breath catching in my throat. The door of the RV creaked open, and the lady stepped inside, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. She set the child on the table and turned to me, her mouth stretching into an unnatural smile. "Sing with me," she whispered, her voice as cold as the creek. I backed away, fumbling for the doll. It was there, lying on the bed. I grabbed it and ran outside, the lady's wail echoing behind me. Desperation drove me to the fire pit. I piled wood and dried leaves, striking a match with trembling hands. The flames roared to life, casting long shadows across the clearing. I threw the doll into the fire, its fabric catching instantly. The lady screamed, her voice piercing and inhuman. Her form flickered, wavering like a mirage. She lunged toward me, but as the doll burned, her body dissolved into mist, scattering on the wind. At dawn, the forest felt different. Lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The RV started without issue, and the slashed tires were miraculously intact. I drove away, not daring to look back. As I crossed a bridge over the creek, my radio crackled to life. For a brief moment, the lady's melody filled the cab before fading into static. I still hear that song sometimes, in my dreams or when I'm near water. It's a reminder that some places should be left alone. My name is Beth Reynolds, and I'm 28 years old. I've always prided myself on being a skeptic, the type of person who can see through the tricks of the world and find the truth hiding underneath. This story I'm about to tell isn't one I ever thought I'd be sharing. It happened last October, deep in the woods of Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas. I was with my best friend, Amber Turner. She's 27 and a complete opposite of me, superstitious and overly cautious. That trip changed the way I see the world, and I can't look at the woods the same way again. It started as a simple weekend camping trip. I'd read about Devil's Den and its spooky reputation, people whispering about shadowy figures, strange noises, and even disappearances. Of course, I didn't believe any of it. Amber wasn't thrilled when I suggested it, but she eventually gave in. One night, she had insisted, her hazel eyes serious. "That's it, Beth." We packed my old tent, some snacks, and Amber's ancient camping gear, which she hadn't touched since college. The drive to Devil's Den was uneventful, and by mid-afternoon we'd found a secluded spot near Yellow Rock Trail. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves a vibrant mix of orange and red, and everything felt perfect. Amber seemed to relax a bit as we set up camp, though she shot me the occasional wary glance, probably still thinking about the ghost stories I'd teased her with on the drive up. By sunset, we'd settled in, cooking hot dogs over the fire and swapping college stories. I felt a pang of nostalgia. It had been too long since we'd done something like this. Amber smiled more as the evening went on, and I was glad I'd convinced her to come. But as the night deepened, the mood began to shift. The first sign of something strange happened while we were cleaning up dinner. We heard a rustling in the woods, faint but deliberate. I glanced up, expecting to see a deer, but the sound stopped. Amber froze, her hand gripping the edge of the picnic table. "Probably just the wind," I said, brushing it off. "Wind doesn't stop like that," Amber muttered. I shrugged, unwilling to let her spook me. But as the hours wore on, the noises continued. Faint whispers, almost like voices, carried on the breeze. Amber grew jumpier, her head snapping toward every sound. "It's nothing," I said, laughing. "Probably just some raccoons." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the dark tree line. I followed her gaze but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the growing unease in my chest. When we crawled into the tent for the night, I was exhausted, ready to sleep off the creepy vibes. Amber insisted on zipping the tent up tight and keeping a flashlight within reach. I rolled my eyes, but didn't argue. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent. It was faint at first, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came closer, deliberate and slow. My heart began to race. "Amber?" I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She stirred, groggy. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She sat up, clutching the flashlight. The sound stopped. We stared at each other in the dark, neither of us daring to move. Then, from just outside the tent, we heard a voice. "Beth," it called softly, almost teasingly. "Come out here." The blood drained from my face. It was my voice. Amber's hand tightened on my arm. "Beth, that's not funny." "I didn't," my voice cracked. "Amber, I didn't say anything." The voice came again, closer this time. "Beth, it's okay, come out." Amber fumbled with the flashlight, her hands shaking. When she finally turned it on, the light flickered weakly. She pointed it at the tent door, her breath shallow. I didn't move, frozen in fear. And then, silence. The rest of the night passed in tense, sleepless silence. Neither of us dared to leave the tent. When dawn finally broke, we ventured outside cautiously. The campsite looked untouched, except for one chilling detail. Strange symbols drawn in the dirt around the tent. They were crude, almost childlike, but something about them made my skin crawl. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. Amber was pale, her hands clenched into fists. "We need to leave." I wanted to argue, to rationalize it away, but I couldn't. There was something deeply wrong here. Still, I convinced Amber to go on one last hike before we packed up. I didn't want to leave empty-handed, and I needed to prove to myself that there was a logical explanation. Reluctantly, she agreed. We took a trail that led deeper into the woods. The further we went, the more oppressive the air felt, like the forest itself was watching us. Amber stayed close, her usual cheerfulness replaced by quiet tension. An hour in, we stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. Its roof sagged, and the windows were broken, but something about it drew me closer. Amber grabbed my arm. "Beth, no." "Come on," I said. "It's just an old cabin." "Please," she whispered. "Something's wrong." I hesitated, but brushed her off. Stepping onto the creaking porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. Strange carvings adorned the walls, symbols similar to the ones we'd seen around our tent. My stomach churned. "Beth!" Amber called from outside. Her voice shook. "We need to go. Now!" I turned to leave, but froze. A shadow moved across the far wall, though no one was there. My breath hitched. Suddenly, I believed Amber. We ran. Back on the trail, the forest seemed darker, the air heavier. Footsteps echoed behind us, matching our pace. I glanced back, but no one was there. Then I heard Amber scream. I turned to see her staring at something in the trees. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It looked human, but its proportions were wrong. Too tall, its limbs too long. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on me. We ran faster, panic driving us forward. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. When we finally reached the campsite, we grabbed our things and bolted for the car. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. Amber and I never spoke about that night again. I stopped camping, stopped laughing at ghost stories. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear a voice outside my window. It sounds like me. My name is Jack Holloway. I'm 35 years old, a travel photographer by trade, and I'll admit, a bit of a loner. I'm not sure if it's by choice or habit at this point, but I've always preferred the company of my camera over people. At least, that's what I told myself until last October, when I went on a solo trip to Big Creek Natural Area in Arkansas. That trip changed everything for me. It's the reason I haven't touched my RV since. It all started when my agent, Lisa, told me my portfolio needed fresh material. "Your work is good, Jack," she said, her tone just shy of nagging. "But it's feeling a little stale. Get out there, find some inspiration." Inspiration. That word rang hollow in my ears. Ever since my breakup with Emma, nothing felt inspiring. We'd been together for 6 years, and when she left, it was like she took the color out of my world. But I wasn't one to wallow. Not outwardly, at least. So I decided to take Lisa's advice and hit the road. Big Creek caught my attention because it was remote, untouched, and shrouded in mist during the fall. Perfect for moody landscapes. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near the creek, the water winding like a silver ribbon through the dense woods. The place was breathtakingly quiet, almost too quiet, but I welcomed the solitude. It was what I needed, time to think, to work, and maybe to forget. The first day went well enough. I spent hours hiking and shooting photos, capturing the interplay of light and shadow on the creek's surface. But as evening fell, the air grew colder, and an unsettling stillness settled over the area. I chalked it up to my nerves. Emma always said I got too caught up in my own head when I was alone. That night, as I reviewed the day's shots in the RV, I heard it. A faint whisper just outside the window. It sounded like my name. "Jack!" I froze, staring at the window. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost mournful. I told myself it was the wind playing tricks, but the rationalization didn't stick. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. I pulled the curtain back and peered outside, my heart pounding. Nothing. Just the inky darkness of the woods. I shook it off and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Dreams of Emma haunted me, her voice echoing in the woods, calling me back to the place where we'd first met. It was surreal and disorienting, like my subconscious was playing a cruel joke. The next morning, I decided to fly my drone over the creek for some aerial shots. It was my favorite piece of equipment, a top-of-the-line model that I trusted implicitly. But as it soared over the water, the screen on my controller went static. I frowned, trying to recalibrate, but the drone plummeted into the creek, vanishing beneath the surface. "Damn it," I muttered, cursing my bad luck. I couldn't afford to lose it, so I waded into the creek, the icy water soaking through my boots. The current was stronger than it looked, and as I reached the spot where the drone had gone down, I saw something that made me stop cold. A face, pale and featureless, staring up at me from the depths. The water rippled, distorting the image, but it was unmistakable. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. By the time I looked again, the face was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe my reflection warped by the current. But my hands were shaking as I climbed back to the bank, and my stomach churned with unease. I tried to focus on the photos, but the events of the morning clung to me like a shadow. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was ready to leave. But the RV's generator had other plans. It sputtered and died, leaving me without power. I checked the fuel, the lines, everything I could think of, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I decided to make the best of it and turned in early. That night, the whispers returned. "Jack," they called, soft and insistent. "Come outside." I lay frozen in my bunk, my heart hammering against my ribs. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Then came the sound of footsteps, wet and deliberate, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and flung the door open, determined to confront whatever or whoever was out there. The woods were silent, the mist curling around the trees like ghostly fingers. But as I scanned the ground, my breath caught in my throat. Wet footprints trailed from the creek to the RV, stopping just short of the door. They were small, like a woman's, and the sight sent a chill racing down my spine. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The only response was the faint rustle of leaves. The next day, I debated leaving. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and go, but something kept me there. Curiosity, maybe, or stubbornness. I decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to find some rational explanation for the strange occurrences. That's when I saw her. She was standing by the creek, her back to me, dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her long hair was matted and damp, hanging down to her waist. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but there was something about her presence that rooted me to the spot. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned slowly, her face obscured by her hair. I raised my camera, instinct taking over, but the moment I framed the shot, she was gone, vanished like smoke. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman, about the face I'd seen in the creek. When I returned to the RV, I did some research on my phone, digging into the history of Big Creek. What I found made my blood run cold. Decades ago, a flood had wiped out a small settlement near the creek. Dozens of people had died, their bodies swept away by the raging water. Among them was a woman named Caroline, who'd been searching for her lost child when the floodwaters took her. Her body was never recovered. The dots connected too easily. The woman, the whispers, the footprints. Caroline. That night, I tried to leave an offering by the creek, hoping to appease her spirit. I placed a small pile of stones and muttered an apology, feeling foolish but desperate. The woods remained silent, but the air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As I returned to the RV, the atmosphere shifted. The mist thickened, and the temperature plummeted. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me, but I wasn't alone. She was there, standing in the corner of the RV, her gown dripping with water. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. The air reeked of algae and decay. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a mournful wail. "Why didn't you help me?" "I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. "I don't know." She lunged, her cold, wet hands gripping my wrist. Pain shot through me and I screamed, wrenching free. I grabbed Emma's bracelet, the one I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and held it out like a talisman. Caroline froze, her empty eyes fixed on the bracelet. her expression softened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of humanity. Then she was gone, leaving only a puddle of water on the floor. I didn't wait to see if she'd come back. I started the RV. Miraculously, the generator roared to life and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles away. Even now, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I'll never set foot near Big Creek again. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice in the distance calling my name. My name is Emily Harper, and I'm 29 years old. I've been a photographer for almost a decade, specializing in abandoned places and forgotten histories. People love the kind of eerie, atmospheric shots that tell stories of the past, and I love capturing them. This story, though, is one I wish I'd never lived through. It happened last October when I went to Salem Cemetery near Benton, Arkansas. If you've ever heard of it, you probably know it's rumored to be cursed. I should have listened to the warnings. The day started like any other. I parked my RV in a small clearing a few miles from the cemetery and unloaded my camera gear. The woods around Salem Cemetery were quiet, the kind of stillness that's almost comforting, almost. I'd read about the cemetery's history, unmarked graves, tragedies, and whispers of a child's ghost. Local legends, I thought. Nothing more. Finding the trail wasn't easy. My GPS started acting up as I got closer, and the map on my phone froze. I switched it off and decided to rely on instinct. After about 20 minutes of weaving through overgrown brush, I found the cemetery. It was hauntingly beautiful. Old headstones jutted out at odd angles, covered in moss and weathered by time. The air felt cooler here, but I didn't think much of it. I set up my tripod and began shooting. Each shot felt perfect. The light filtering through the trees, the crumbling gravestones. This was exactly the kind of material I needed. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, I noticed a small wooden doll lying near one of the graves. It was carved crudely, its features worn smooth by time. I picked it up, curious. It had a strange weight to it, heavier than it looked. I placed the doll on the ground to frame it in a shot, but something about the air shifted. A faint giggle echoed through the trees. I froze, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. There was no answer, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Shaking off the nerves, I finished my photos and decided to head back before sunset. When I turned to leave, the doll wasn't where I'd left it. Instead, it was propped against another grave, staring at me with its blank wooden eyes. My stomach churned, but I told myself I must have knocked it over earlier. Back at the RV, I reviewed my photos. Something was wrong. The images were distorted, streaked with strange light flares that hadn't been there before. In one photo, I could have sworn I saw a faint outline of a child standing behind a gravestone. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding, but the figure was so faint it could have been a trick of the light. As the night fell, the woods grew unnervingly quiet. I locked the RV door and settled in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, a soft knock echoed through the RV. Knock, knock. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up, straining to listen. The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The cold air bit at my skin as I stepped out, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark. No one was there. I turned back toward the RV and stopped. The doll was sitting on the steps, its head tilted as if watching me. My chest tightened. I hadn't brought the doll back with me, I was sure of it. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the doll didn't move, didn't blink. Slowly, I reached down, picked it up, and tossed it into the woods. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I was ready to leave. Whatever was happening, I didn't want any part of it. But as I packed up, my phone buzzed with a notification. My photos had uploaded to the cloud, and I couldn't resist taking one last look. That's when I saw it. Clear as day. In one of the frames, standing behind a headstone, was a boy. He wore old-fashioned clothes, and his face was pale, almost featureless. My stomach turned. I had to know more. Using my laptop, I searched for the history of Salem Cemetery. It didn't take long to find the story of Eli Carter, a 7-year-old boy who died in the late 1800s. His grave was unmarked, lost among the others, but local legends said his spirit haunted the cemetery, punishing anyone who disturbed it. I felt a chill run down my spine. The doll. It had to be connected to Eli. Determined to make things right, I returned to the cemetery that afternoon, carrying the doll with me. The woods felt different, darker somehow, even though the sun was still high. I retraced my steps to where I'd first found the doll and placed it back near the grave. "I'm sorry," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to disturb you." For a moment, nothing happened. The air remained still, the woods silent. Then, a giggle broke the quiet, soft and sinister. I turned, scanning the graves, but no one was there. My pulse quickened and I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I reached the edge of the cemetery, I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned. Eli stood there, his hollow eyes fixed on me. His face was pale and expressionless, but his small hand clutched the doll tightly. He tilted his head, studying me, and I froze, unable to move. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice high and distant, like a child calling from the end of a long hallway. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't know." He took a step closer, and the air grew colder, frost forming on the grass around him. My breath fogged in the air, and I felt the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. Desperate, I remembered something I'd read during my research, that leaving an offering could appease a spirit. I fumbled with my necklace, a silver chain my grandmother had given me, and held it out. "Here," I said, my voice shaking. "It's yours. Please let me go." Eli stared at the necklace for a long moment before reaching out and taking it. His fingers were ice cold, and when they brushed mine, a wave of sadness washed over me, so deep and overwhelming that I felt tears well up in my eyes. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Eli was gone. The air warmed, the frost melted, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. I stood there for what felt like hours trying to process what had just happened. When I finally returned to the RV, the woods were quiet again, almost peaceful. I drove away without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The doll, the whispers, Eli, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. Days later, when I developed the rest of my photos, I found him again. In every frame I'd taken near his grave, Eli's figure lingered, faint but unmistakable. I wrote about my experience for the magazine, but even now, I wonder if it was worth it. Some places are better left alone. Salem Cemetery is one of them. And if you ever find yourself wandering near Benton, Arkansas, take my advice. Don't go looking for Eli. You might not like what you find. My name is Sarah Hastings, and I'm 29 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened in the fall of last year, during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in the Ozark National Forest. It was meant to be a bonding trip for my boyfriend Michael, my best friend Rachel, and me. What it became, I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand. We had parked our RV at the edge of a clearing, just off a narrow dirt road leading into the forest. Michael, ever the adventurous one, had insisted we hike to a place called Midnight Hollow, a forgotten settlement he'd read about online. He said it was untouched and mysterious, as if those were selling points. I should have known better, but I'd agreed. Rachel, 27 and more cautious, had only come along because she didn't want me to go alone. The hike started out promising enough. The air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as we followed the trail marked on an old map I'd printed. Michael was leading the way, his pack jangling with carabiners and gear he'd insisted we bring, even though he vetoed Rachel's extra blanket. "We won't need it," he'd said. "Keep it minimalist." Rachel and I exchanged a look as we trailed behind him. She mouthed, "Control freak," and I stifled a laugh. For a while, it felt like an ordinary camping trip. The trees closed in around us, the sun filtering through the branches in golden streaks. But then we saw the first sign that something wasn't right. It was a crude effigy hanging from a low branch. Twigs twisted into the shape of a person, tied with what looked like animal sinew. It spun lazily in the breeze, casting a jagged shadow on the ground. "What the hell is that?" Rachel asked, stepping closer. Michael shrugged. "Probably a prank. Locals messing with hikers." But the thing is, we were miles from the nearest road, and we hadn't seen a single soul all day. Who would bother coming out here just to set up something like that? I wanted to turn back, but Michael was already pressing on, brushing it off like it was nothing. The effigies grew more frequent as we hiked deeper into the woods. Some were smaller, barely noticeable unless you were looking for them. Others were larger, more elaborate, their twig limbs splayed at unnatural angles. The forest grew quieter, too, as if the birds and insects had decided this was a place they wanted no part of. By the time we reached Midnight Hollow, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The settlement was little more than a cluster of crumbling cabins and overgrown foundations. One cabin stood out. It was larger, with broken windows that gaped like empty eyes. The air here felt heavier, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten tragedies pressed down on us. "Let's check it out," Michael said, already heading for the cabin. "Michael, no," Rachel said. "This place is giving me the creeps. Can't we just set up camp and leave in the morning?" But he was already inside, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. I followed reluctantly, with Rachel close behind. The cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. The walls were etched with strange symbols, some of which looked disturbingly fresh. A shattered mirror lay on the floor, its shards catching the faint light like jagged teeth. In the corner, I found an old diary, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it gingerly, flipping through pages filled with spidery handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but one entry caught my eye. "We gave her what she wanted, but she still lingers. She always lingers." My stomach turned as I read it. "I don't like this," I said, my voice trembling. "We should go." Michael scoffed. "It's just a diary, Sarah. Don't let it freak you out." But something about the words felt like a warning. That night, as we set up camp just outside the settlement, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first sign of trouble came around midnight. Rachel and I were in the tent while Michael slept in his hammock a few yards away. I woke to the sound of whispers, faint but unmistakable. At first, I thought it was Rachel talking in her sleep, but then I realized the whispers were coming from outside. "Michael?" I called softly. No answer. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The clearing was bathed in silvery moonlight, but something felt off. The shadows seemed too deep, too dark, as if they were alive. And then I saw them. Footprints in the mud. leading from Michael's hammock toward the tree line. They were large and oddly spaced, as if whatever had made them wasn't walking, but dragging its feet. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Rachel's voice was a harsh whisper behind me. "Michael's gone," I said. "I think he—" A scream cut through the night, high and piercing. It sounded like a child, but it was distorted, wrong. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rachel grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to leave," she said, her voice shaking. I wanted to agree, but Michael was still out there. Against my better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the woods. The trees closed in around us, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The footprints led us deeper and deeper until we reached a clearing where the ground was littered with more effigies, these ones larger and more grotesque. At the center was Michael, standing stock still, his back to us. "Michael!" I called. He didn't move. Rachel tugged at my arm. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "We need to go." But I couldn't leave him. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Michael, it's me. Are you okay?" He turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. His eyes were vacant, his face slack, but his lips were moving, whispering words I couldn't understand. And then he smiled. A terrible, crooked smile that didn't belong on his face. "She's coming," he said, his voice a rasp. That's when I saw her. A tall, gaunt figure stepped out of the shadows, her limbs impossibly long and her hollow eyes locked onto us. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. The air around her seemed to shimmer, distorting reality. Rachel screamed and bolted, and I followed, dragging Michael with me. The witch didn't chase us, but her presence lingered, a suffocating weight on my chest. By the time we reached the RV, the sun was beginning to rise, casting the forest in pale, ghostly light. Michael never spoke of what happened that night. He became withdrawn. His once bright personality dimmed. As for Rachel, she refuses to talk to me now, blaming me for dragging her into that nightmare. And me? I can't shake the feeling that the witch isn't finished with us. Every now and then I find small effigies near my apartment, and at night I hear whispers that sound an awful lot like my name. I still don't know what we unleashed in Midnight Hollow. All I know is this: some places are forgotten for a reason, and some things are better left undisturbed. My name is James Tucker, but everyone calls me Jim. I'm 42 years old, and what happened to me last fall in the Buffalo National River area of Arkansas changed the way I look at everything. Life, death, even the silence of the wilderness. I'm a photographer by trade, specializing in landscapes, and I thought I'd seen it all. I was wrong. This trip was supposed to be about peace, maybe even healing. 2 years earlier, I'd lost my wife, Martha, in a hiking accident. She'd slipped on a rock ledge, and before I could catch her, she was gone. I've lived with that guilt ever since. The only thing that's ever helped is my camera, so I packed up my RV and headed for Buffalo National River, a place I'd always wanted to capture. I arrived in late October, just as the leaves were peaking in their fiery reds and golds. The campground was nearly deserted, which suited me fine. I wanted solitude, just the quiet hum of the river and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I parked my RV near a trailhead that led to Hemmed-In Hollow Falls, the tallest waterfall in Arkansas. I planned to photograph it at sunrise. The first sign of trouble came at the general store in Jasper, where I stopped for supplies. Behind the counter was a woman in her 70s, her hair tied back in a neat bun. Her name tag read Lila. "You heading up to the falls?" she asked as she rang up my purchases. "Yeah," I said, smiling. Figured I'd camp near the trailhead and make a day of it tomorrow. Lila's smile faltered. She glanced at the map I'd spread out on the counter and pointed to a spot near the falls. "Stay clear of this area," she said. "Why's that?" She hesitated, then leaned in as if sharing a secret. "We call it the echoes. People go there and hear things. Voices, laughter, crying. Some don't come back." I laughed, trying to shake off the unease her words stirred in me. "Old campfire stories?" Her expression didn't change. "Just be careful," she said. That evening, I set out on the trail. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I walked with my camera slung around my neck, snapping photos of the golden light filtering through the trees. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn chill that bites your cheeks but leaves you invigorated. As I neared the falls, the trail grew steeper, winding through narrow canyons. The sound of the river echoed off the cliffs, a constant, soothing backdrop. But then something odd happened. The echoes shifted. What had been the rhythmic rush of water now sounded like laughter. I stopped, holding my breath. The laughter was faint, almost melodic, and achingly familiar. It sounded like Martha. "Hello," I called, my voice bouncing back at me in fragments. The laughter stopped, replaced by the usual roar of the falls. I shook my head, blaming my imagination. The light was fading, and I needed to find a place to camp. That night, I camped near the falls, my RV parked in a clearing. After setting up a small fire, I reviewed the day's photos on my laptop. The cliffs, the river, the trees, all captured in perfect golden light. But as I scrolled, one image made me pause. It was a shot of the falls taken from the base, and there, standing on the ledge above, was a figure. It was blurry, but the shape was unmistakable. A woman in a long coat, her hair blowing in the wind. My heart raced as I stared at the image. It couldn't be Martha. She was gone. I had to be mistaken, or maybe it was another hiker I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew the truth. I didn't sleep much that night. The RV felt too small, the shadows too deep. Around midnight, I heard it again. Laughter, faint and fleeting. This time, it came from right outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the clearing. The air was cold, my breath misting in the beam of light. I swung the flashlight in an arc, illuminating the trees, the trail, the riverbank. Nothing. And then, just as I turned back toward the RV, I heard a whisper. It was Martha's voice, clear as day. "Jim?" The next morning, I hiked back toward the falls, determined to make sense of what was happening. The trail felt different in the daylight, less oppressive, but the memory of that whisper stayed with me. About halfway to the falls, I stumbled upon something I hadn't noticed the day before. A circle of stones, arranged around what looked like an altar. It was covered in trinkets, worn photographs, bits of jewelry, carved wooden figures. Among them was a Polaroid, faded with age. I picked it up carefully. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of hemmed-in Hollow Falls, smiling. On the back, someone had scrawled a single word, "Leave." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I set the photo back on the altar and backed away. By the time I reached the falls, the air felt heavy, almost electric. I set up my tripod at the base, framing the shot I'd come for. The water tumbling over the cliff, framed by fiery autumn leaves. But as I adjusted the focus, something moved in the viewfinder. It was her. Martha stood at the edge of the falls, her coat billowing in the breeze, her arms outstretched as if inviting me to join her. I dropped the camera and scrambled to my feet. "Martha!" I shouted. She didn't move, didn't look at me. And then, just as quickly as she'd appeared, she was gone. That night, I returned to the general store, desperate for answers. Lila was sweeping the floor when I burst in, my camera clutched in one hand. "I saw her," I said, my voice shaking. "I saw Martha. What the hell is happening here?" Lila set down her broom, her face grim. "I warned you," she said. "The echoes. They take what you want most and turn it against you. They're not your wife, Jim. They're not anything human." "But why me?" "Because you brought it with you. Your grief, your guilt. It's like blood in the water." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. Martha wasn't haunting me. The echoes were. The next day, I hiked back to the altar. I was done running. If the echoes wanted to use my grief against me, I'd face them head on. As I approached the circle of stones, the forest grew eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn ground. "I'm here!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the cliffs. "What do you want from me?" The laughter came first, then the whispers, rising in a cacophony until I thought my head would split. Shadows danced among the trees, growing darker and closer, and then she appeared. Martha stepped out of the shadows, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Jim," she said, her voice trembling, "why did you let me fall?" "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It was an accident." The shadows swirled around her, pulling at her form, twisting it into something monstrous. Her smile turned cruel, her eyes black as coal. "You left me," she hissed. "No!" I shouted. "I didn't leave you. I loved you. I still love you." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the locket I always carried, the one she'd given me on our anniversary. I placed it on the altar, my hands trembling. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I can't keep holding on. I have to let you go." The forest erupted in a deafening roar, the shadows convulsing and retreating, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the altar. Eventually, I made my way back to the RV, my body aching, my heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. As I drove away, I heard one final whisper, faint and filled with warmth. "Thank you, Jim." I haven't returned to the Buffalo National River since, and I probably never will. But sometimes, when I'm out photographing the quiet places of the world, I feel a presence, gentle and comforting, as if she's still watching over me. Maybe that's just my imagination. Or maybe, just maybe, the echoes gave her back to me in their own way. My name is Heather Monroe. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life working as an ER nurse. I've seen people at their worst, their most vulnerable, and sometimes their last moments. But nothing prepared me for what happened last fall in the Ouachita National Forest. It started as a weekend getaway. Burned out from long shifts and restless nights, I decided to take my RV into the woods to reset. The Ouachitas seemed like the perfect place. Quiet, remote, and beautiful in late October, with the trees in full fiery bloom. I told myself this trip was about finding peace, but deep down I knew there was another reason I'd chosen this place. 10 years ago, my younger brother Ethan went missing here. He was only 22, full of life and dreams, and then gone. The official story was that he got lost hiking and probably fell into a ravine. They never found his body. The guilt never left me. I should have stopped him from coming here alone. I should have been there to protect him. I arrived at the forest in the late afternoon, the sunlight slanting through the trees like golden arrows. After parking the RV near a secluded trailhead, I grabbed my pack and headed toward Whistle Hollow, the area where Ethan was last seen. At a clearing near the forest's edge, I ran into an older woman tending a small garden beside a weathered cabin. Her hair was gray and pulled back tight, her hands knotted like the roots of an old tree. She squinted at me as I passed. "You heading toward the hollow?" she asked, her voice gravelly. I stopped, caught off guard. "Yeah, why?" Her gaze hardened. "You hear the whistle, you don't follow it. You understand me. You turn around and go the other way." "Whistle?" I asked, frowning. She shook her head. "Devil's whistle. Lures folks in. Most don't come back." I wanted to dismiss her warning as a local superstition, but something about her tone made my stomach knot. Still, I forced a smile. "I'll keep that in mind." She didn't smile back. "You'd better." That night, I made camp near the base of the trail. The forest was alive with the sounds of cicadas and rustling leaves, a comforting background to my solitude. But as the night deepened, the usual hum of the woods faded, replaced by a strange silence. And then I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whistle, like the sound of a train in the distance. It was so soft at first I thought I'd imagined it, but it grew louder, sharper, until it seemed to echo through the trees. I stepped outside the RV, flashlight in hand, scanning the dark forest. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Just as I was about to go back inside, the whistle stopped, replaced by a new sound. Laughter, a man's laughter, clear and familiar. "Ethan?" I whispered. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, the unease returned. The trail was overgrown, branches clawing at my jacket, but I pressed on, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. Around midday, I came across something strange. A rusted railroad lantern hanging from a tree, its glass cracked and fogged with dirt. Beneath it was a pile of trinkets. Faded photos, broken watches, a child's stuffed bear, all covered in moss. It looked like a memorial. And there, at the edge of the pile, was something that stopped me cold. Ethan's bracelet. I picked it up, my hands shaking. I'd given it to him the Christmas before he disappeared. A simple leather band with a silver clasp. There was no mistaking it. "Ethan!" I shouted, spinning in a circle, my voice echoing through the trees. No answer. Only the wind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whistle came again, louder this time, and with it, the sound of footsteps crunching outside the RV. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the circle of my campfire's light. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket I recognized immediately. It was Ethan. I flung open the door and stepped outside. "Ethan!" I called, my voice breaking. He turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt, but unmistakably his. "Heather," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Tears blurred my vision as I stepped closer. "Ethan, is it really you? Where have you been?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the trees. "Wait!" I cried, following him. He didn't look back. The forest seemed darker, the trees closer together, as I chased him deeper into the woods. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, and the whistle was deafening now, like it was coming from all around me. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. At the center stood an old railroad track, overgrown with weeds and moss. On the platform was a rusted whistle, its metal corroded and twisted, yet somehow still functional. Around it, shadowy figures moved, their forms flickering like static on a broken TV. Ethan stood among them, his eyes hollow and sad. "Heather," he said, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come here." I took a step closer, tears streaming down my face. "Ethan, what's happening? What is this place?" "It's the whistle," he said. "It draws people in, feeds on them. I tried to leave, but I can't." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "No, we'll figure it out. We'll destroy it, and you'll come home with me." He smiled faintly, a look of deep sorrow. "You can't destroy it, but you can leave. Please, Heather, go, before it takes you too." The shadowy figures began to close in, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. I felt their cold hands clawing at me, pulling me toward the whistle. But I couldn't leave Ethan. "No!" I screamed, grabbing a large rock from the ground. "I'm not leaving you." I rushed toward the whistle, my heart pounding. The shadows seemed to writhe and screech as I brought the rock down on the corroded metal again and again, until it shattered with a piercing wail. The figures vanished. When I turned, Ethan was gone too. I stumbled back to the RV at dawn, my body aching, my mind reeling. On the dashboard I found Ethan's bracelet, polished and clean, as if it had just been placed there. I don't know what I unleashed that night or if I truly set Ethan free, but as I drove away, the forest fading in my rearview mirror, I heard one final whistle, faint and distant, like a train disappearing into the horizon. Some part of me wonders if it's still out there waiting for someone else to hear its call. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back. Not ever.